Imagine if reality catered to the golden rule. Treat thy neighbor as thyself, but not just in a moral sense. Picture if every single person and every single being, just every single thing, had all their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, desires, etc., just like all of them catered to. Now, the sentimental topics like subsistence, the more academic ones, that'll be different than this video. But picture if you just had all that satisfied. Every single thought, belief, idea, just everything. Not even just thoughts and ideas and all that, right? I mean, even things that don't really pertain to those areas, So if you want to talk about like no mind, or even just things that don't necessarily have what people would call consciousness, whether or not it would fit your definition of consciousness, like rocks don't necessarily have thoughts, like things like that. Just picture if every single thing were catered to in that way, where its quote unquote view was satisfied. Well, see, that would result in obviously like a huge subjectivity, but the subjectivity would be so intense and so objective. It would be such a high level of objective subjectivity that even the subjectivity itself would be subjective, right? Because there would be views or ideas or beliefs that are more absolutist. And so if those are catered to, if those are satisfied, then reality would simultaneously be absolutist, where like there's one fixed truth or something like that. I've gone over this before, how like picture if the quote unquote perspective of a blade of grass was the absolute truth. So it's that sort of stuff. It gets so subjective or so relative that it includes objectivity. It includes absoluteness, right? So like subjectivity includes objectivity, relativity includes absoluteness, right? Because it's so subjective that even the subjectivity itself is subjective. Or if you want to use the term relativity instead, you could say it's so relative that even the relativity itself is relative. But if the relativity itself is relative, well, then that means that even it can fail in certain circumstances. There can fail to be that relativity, which would then be replaced by absoluteness. So I use those terms interchangeably. I use the terms objective and absolute interchangeably, just like I use the terms subjective and relative interchangeably. But this is not just like a relativism in like some sort of postmodern sense, or like a sort of perspectivalism like what you'll hear from Deepak Chopra or Leo Gura or all those people. Like when they talk about relativism, they're really talking about like one specific type of relativism, which is perspectivalism. Like every perspective is essentially true. So like a flat earther who believes that we're living on a flat earth, that's true in a sense. Now, I'm not saying like Deepak Chopra or Leo Gura or any of them would necessarily believe that, but like in some sense, like they think there's some sense or context in which like we are living on a flat earth. Like, I've heard one of them use the example of like a particle zooming towards the earth, and like the earth would be flat from its perspective. Like they'll come up with all these sorts of context to like justify the flat earther, but at the end of the day, that's not what the flat earther believes. The flat earther doesn't believe that, oh, well, relative to some particle moving at the speed of light, the earth is flat. No, I think relative to me here, as I am, as a human being, I think the earth is flat. And at the end of the day, that's false, right? Maybe I have some flat earthers in my audience, I don't know, but study astronomy. Like it's okay to just be wrong. But see, notice that I can say that. I can say that something is just 100% wrong. I don't have to cater to it, because ironically, I'm so relativistic that I am more relativistic than a postmodernist. I am more relativistic than the sort of perspectivalism that you find in standard like spiritual teachings, right? It's a relativity where, again, it's so relative that even the relativity itself becomes relative. And so that breaks past the relativity and goes into absoluteness. So whenever we say something is relative, that means that it fails to be true in some circumstance. So there's a circumstance that transcends it. It's like independent of it. And so that relative truth fails to be true in that further circumstance, because that circumstance is just outside of its jurisdiction, right? So when we say something is relative, translate it as meaning that we can break past it. Right? So if relativity is itself relative, then we can break past relativity and find other stuff, like its quote unquote opposite, which is absoluteness. And so that's how things are able to be absolute in a hyper-relativistic reality, right? Because if reality is absolutely relative, then even the relativity itself is relative, and so we can get absolute truths. We can live inside of circumstances in which one specific truth, like round Earth, is the only truth, and that's it. Stuff like that. But see, it goes further, because you could say, okay, well, the fact that we have both of these statuses on reality, that like there's relativity and then there's absoluteness, okay, that in of itself would then be relative. So we could break past that and have stuff that is beyond both of those statuses. You have stuff that's neither relative nor absolute. And then that becomes relative. So you could break past that, and so you could keep breaking into these further and further and further jurisdictions where each concept we come up with keeps getting blown to bits. It keeps getting deconstructed. And so you already recognize where that carries us, right? The sort of explosive nature of this condition or of reality. It just kind of keeps going. You can never grasp it. You can never really even point at it per se. And so it just becomes very mystifying. And it leaves you speechless, such that even the speechlessness isn't good enough. So we would reach that sort of absolute relativity if we lived in a reality in which the golden rule applied, in which every single quote-unquote view was catered to, every thought, every idea, but not just every thought or idea, right? Not just mental or conscious stuff like that, but even the quote-unquote view of a rock, which doesn't have thoughts. If all of that was catered to, if reality treated every neighbor as every other neighbor, right? Like each neighbor was treated as thyself, then we would have that. And so, see, that's where it gets sort of interesting, is this would mean that reality is unbiased to an extent that in order to study it and in order to quote-unquote understand it, it would be best to study it through ethical analysis rather than merely logical analysis, right? Because think about it, the golden rule in various religions, it's often taught as a sort of moral guideline. But here, what we're going over is this idea that it doesn't have to just be a moral guideline. It can also, strangely enough, be an epistemic one. It can pertain to a sort of pure understanding of things. So I talked about like the pure axiomless logic in my past videos, but you can combine that with ethics, right? Logic and ethics are often deemed to be diametrically opposed to each other, right? Because logic, it's about using rationality. It's very cold, very methodical. You use it to solve problems or just think things through from premises to a conclusion, right? Whereas ethics, it's more concerned with well-being, right? People's well-being, animals' well-being, just the well-being of things in general. And so ethics, it's more customizable, right? Logic, at least classical logic, is very fixed. It's got a fixed set of axioms and it's very linear. There's right and wrong ways to advance from premises to a conclusion, right? So it's very structured. But with ethics, I mean, like, you basically get to just say what's ethical. Like, okay, why is getting shot by a gun wrong? Why is that bad? Why is that unethical? Well, because you wouldn't like it, right? You get to just say it's bad, right? If it feels bad to you, if it's bad to your well-being, physical, mental, emotional, etc., you get to just say that's bad. And that's not a problem that you get to just say it. That is what ethics is. Ethics is customizable. You get to customize what is ethical as you would customize a character in an RPG. That, like, think of how cool ethics is, that you literally get to mold it. It's like an art piece. It's like a customizable character. You get to shape it. Now, yeah, of course, we have to hold back a little bit because, you know, since we don't live in a vacuum, we can't just say, oh, well, I want to go out there and just, like, you know, punch somebody in the face, right? So, like, we have to sacrifice our ethics to some extent to live in a society, you know. By the way, I don't want to punch on anybody in the face. You know, I'm not trying to make myself out to be a psychopath, but I'm just saying, let's say that did contribute to somebody's enjoyment and therefore it contributed to their well-being. Okay, well, yeah, okay, then you could say punching somebody in the face would be ethical to them, but it starts to infringe on other people's well-being. And since we don't live in a vacuum, we have to strike a balance between our ethics and the ethics of other people's, right? So yes, ethics is customizable, but due to us living in a society, we can't just go all out with the customization. But, if we lived in a perfect reality where we could all do whatever we wanted and not hurt other people, then yeah, it would be no holds barred. You could do whatever you want, punch somebody in the face, and not only would they not feel it as pain, they would feel it as something enjoyable, like that sort of thing. Those sorts of realities exist, by the way. So yeah, none of that undermines the fact that ethics is still freely customizable. But with that said, going back to what that would therefore mean about an ethical analysis of reality, it would mean that we would have to look at reality not just through like a purely structured logical lens, but through customization. That every thought, every idea, every quote-unquote view of everything customizes reality. And no, I don't mean in a sort of law of attraction way. Again, that's a very shallow type of customization, like how perspectivalism is a very shallow form of relativism. No, what you have to remember is, again, if every single quote-unquote view dictates reality, one of those views is going to be absolutist, where here you are just stuck in this reality where not everything goes your way, right? So no, this does not mean that the law of attraction is real. We could live in a purely scientific, physicalistic reality with all this being the case. So don't think that, again, this is like a sort of do whatever you want sort of a thing. That's not quite the case. Not necessarily. But it would say something of reality as a whole, that every single view gets catered to. And that would ironically lead to the exact same ad hoc anythingness that we've gone over even through the pure axiomless logic, which I've talked about. So this is where logic and ethics, which, as I said, are often considered to be diametrically opposed, this is where the distinction between them collapses, in that pure logic is identical to pure ethics. Pure logos is pure ethos. Essentially, they are combined. So we wouldn't just be studying reality through logical analysis via a pure axiomless logos. We would also be studying it through an ethical analysis of this raw, unbiased, golden ruled ethos. And that's where the golden rule can be extended beyond merely a moral guideline into an epistemic one. So it's kind of cool that you have the golden rule taught at the core of every single religion, or at least almost every single religion, right? Virtually every single religion around the globe teaches something like the golden rule at its core. And what's cool is that that seed, that core at the center of every single religion, can not only be taken as a moral guideline, but an epistemic one. It can be taken as an analysis of reality. And if we were to do that, if reality really were of such a nature, then we would get this explosive, ad hoc, anythingness, for lack of better terms, right? You'd get the it, the pronoun that I've talked about. But again, not just an it in the sense that it's fixed to that pronoun. You got to deconstruct that pronoun too. It's not just going to include stuff that's an it, right? It's not just going to include any and all its. It's even going to include stuff that's not an it, or neither is nor isn't an it. So you got to stretch further. Again, that's where the relativity comes into play. Each thing being relative means we can break past each thing. So we go all the way to that it pronoun, you got to break past that too, because even that would be relative. You just keep going and going and going. So this is where reality would satisfy not only logos, but ethos. It would be a literal manifestation of the golden rule taught at the very center of virtually every single religion. I realize that may sound stupid or crazy. I realize no religious scholar would agree with that interpretation. I mean, well, I shouldn't say that. I have actually discussed this with some scholars, some religious studies professors, and they did actually like it. I mean, they did like the interpretation. They just said it was original. Like, okay, maybe the people who authored religious texts weren't thinking that way. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but we like what you're extrapolating from it. So maybe they wouldn't necessarily think I'm crazy, hopefully, but either way, can't necessarily read what I'm saying here into the text per se, not any more than anybody else's interpretation, at least. But hey, that's the golden rule, right? You cater to every single interpretation and it becomes purely relative, such that something absolutist may or may not come out of it. So anyways, you can also see by this relativity how we break past each of these constraints, how this leads to the sort of ad hoc nature that we've been going over in this video series. Like the world hopping that I discussed in the previous part, you can get ill-defined or undefined prompts satisfied to a well-defined extent. That in of itself has an ethical component, because if you have a prompt in mind that you want to get satisfied, it would only be ethical to satisfy that prompt, right? Like fully satisfy it, where even if it's ill-defined or undefined, the prompt gets carried out to a satisfactory extent, right? An extent that literally satisfies the prompt. It treats the prompt ethically. It treats it with regard to the golden rule. It caters to it. It accommodates it purely. And so if reality is ethically logical or logically ethical in this way, then it would satisfy any and all prompts. Even ill-defined ones, even undefined ones, it would satisfy them to a well-defined extent. And that's where you get the world hopping. So you would get those prompts being satisfied into their entire world, their well-defined world, and then you would get more prompts happening in those worlds, and then those would get satisfied and therefore produced into yet even further worlds. And so again, it keeps going and going and going. So I'll discuss more later on what exactly that feels like. I know I promised in the last part of this video that I would describe to you guys what that feels like in this part, but I got a little carried away here, and I want to try and keep each of these parts bite-sized. So I'm sorry, I lied to you, lied to myself too, but I will get to that later. Hopefully this makes sense, the sort of collapse of the logical and the ethical, right? Of relativity and absoluteness, or subjectivity and objectivity. They collapse together and you explode further, and that gets you the ad hoc nature, which we were going for. And it's this customization which will play a part in my explanation for what it feels like to embody a sort of ad hoc condition. So I'll get to that later. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you all next time. Create a nice day.